Welcome to Silent Queen's Rise. Let's get right into the story. Her former brother-in-law arrived at her front door, driving a brand new pearl-white Range Rover, his third wife's manicured hand resting possessively on his forearm, and a sealed legal envelope tucked under his arm like a weapon he had already decided to use. He had driven 40 minutes from his new waterfront property in Newport to her small, allegedly failing flower farm in Tiverton, Rhode Island, and he was smiling the entire way there. He had been smiling ever since the day 3 years ago, when he had successfully persuaded the rest of the Aldridge family board to strip Audra Calloway of her voting shares, following her divorce from his brother, leaving her with nothing but 12 acres of rocky coastal farmland that everyone, including the family's accountant, the family's attorney, and the family's landscaper, had collectively agreed was absolutely worthless. What Garrett Aldridge did not know, and what he had never bothered to find out, was that Audra had spent the last 36 months doing something he was constitutionally incapable of doing. She had been patient. Chapter 1. The inheritance he forgot to read. Garrett Aldridge was 51 years old and carried himself with the specific, insufferable confidence of a man who had inherited both his money and his opinion of himself. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a kind of deep tan that came not from physical labor, but from extended vacations on boats he paid other people to drive. He wore a pale blue linen shirt, untucked, the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and a pair of dark chinos that probably cost more than the monthly electric bill for the greenhouse Audra had spent last winter insulating by herself. His third wife was named Prue. Prue was 34 and had the sleek, practiced energy of someone who had studied the role of wealthy, second-tier socialite with genuine academic dedication. She wore enormous sunglasses, a silk blouse the color of expensive champagne, and a single enormous gold chain that caught the afternoon sun as she stepped out of the Range Rover and immediately looked down at the gravel driveway beneath her open-toed sandals with visible displeasure. "Is this actually the address?" Prue asked, not bothering to lower her voice as she picked her way carefully around a shallow puddle left from the morning rain. "It looks like a set from a movie about someone losing everything." Garrett laughed. It was the loose, generous laugh of a man entirely comfortable watching other people struggle. "That's essentially what it is," he said, tucking the envelope more firmly under his arm and looking out across the property with the proprietary assessment of a man who had already decided what it was worth. The farm, from the driveway, looked exactly as he expected. The main barn was old. The painted wood siding had weathered to a pale chalky gray. The fencing along the eastern field showed its age, with a few posts leaning at angles that suggested they had given up arguing with the coastal wind. The farmhouse itself was modest, a classic New England cape, with white clapboard siding and black shutters, the kind of house that looked like it apologized for existing. What Garrett did not register, because Garrett had never actually worked land a day in his life, was that the fields behind the house were not dead. They were dormant by design. Row after row of carefully covered garden beds stretched across the property in a precise geometric pattern, protected under low tunnel hoops, draped in white agricultural fleece. The soil beneath those covers, which Garrett was not looking at, had been amended and enriched over 36 months at considerable expense and expertise. It was some of the most methodically prepared growing land in Washington County. But it looked plain from the driveway, and Garrett only ever looked at things from the driveway. Audra Calloway opened the front door before he knocked. She had heard the Range Rover on the gravel. She had, in fact, been expecting this visit for approximately 2 weeks, ever since her attorney had forwarded her the letter from Garrett's legal team regarding what they were calling a land value discrepancy in the original estate partition. She had read the letter once, forwarded it to her own attorney with a 3-word message, "Let them come," and then gone back out to check on her overwintering ranunculus. She stood in the doorway in a pair of worn dark canvas work trousers and a cream-colored thermal Henley, her dark hair pulled back with a plain elastic. Her hands were clean, but carried the faint, permanent staining around the cuticles that comes from years of working with soil and stems. She was 41 years old and looked it, in the way that a well-constructed piece of furniture looks its age, without apology, and with a quiet, structural dignity that made the newness around her seem slightly cheap by comparison. Audra looked at Garrett. Then she looked at Prue, who was shading her eyes against the afternoon sun and looking across the fields with the bored, scanning gaze of someone pricing a vacation rental. "Garrett," Audra said. Her voice was level, unhurried, the particular vocal register of a woman who had long since stopped performing emotions for an audience that never deserved them. You drove a long way to deliver mail. Garrett smiled his easy, confident smile and lifted the envelope. I thought it deserved a personal conversation, Audra, for old time's sake. Audra looked at the envelope. She did not reach for it. You've never valued old times a day in your life, she said. Come in. She turned and walked back inside, leaving the door open behind her. Chapter 2. The farmhouse that was not a farmhouse. Garrett stepped over the threshold already composing, in the back of his confident mind, the description he would give to his attorney later. Rustic. Sparse, confirming our assessment. He had already decided the conversation would take 15 minutes. He had already decided that Audra, who had been operating this property at what his accountant described as a marginal and frankly unsustainable revenue level for 3 years, would sign the document he'd brought because she would need the money. The estate partition had left her with the land, but very little else. He knew, because he had made sure of it, that she had no remaining equity in the Aldridge Family Agricultural Trust that had originally purchased the parcel. She was, as far as his spreadsheet was concerned, a woman holding onto a losing asset with both hands. He stepped into the front hallway and stopped. The interior of the farmhouse was not what the exterior had suggested. The renovation was not loud. It wasn't a glossy, magazine-ready overhaul with quartz countertops and statement pendant lighting imported from Milan. It was something far more unsettling to Garrett, who understood expensive things primarily through their logos. The renovation was considered. Every surface, every material, every proportional decision in the space felt like it had been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had the resources to do it without showing off. The original wide plank floors had been restored to a depth of color that took years and the right hands to achieve. The kitchen, visible through an open archway, was fitted with custom cabinetry in a deep, earthy sage, the hardware a brushed, unlacquered brass that had already begun to develop a living patina. The countertops were a dense matte soapstone, veined in silver and charcoal. On the open shelving, rows of hand-thrown ceramic vessels held dried botanicals, lavender, strawflower, globe amaranth, in the precise, artful arrangement that Audra had originally trained in before she'd ever met the Aldridge family. There was a fire going in the original stone hearth. Above the fireplace hung a large format botanical illustration, hand-rendered in ink, depicting a field of ranunculus in 3 stages of bloom. Garrett stared at it for a moment before he recognized that it was an original piece, not a print. Sit down, Audra said, gesturing toward the long, heavy dining table in the adjacent room. The table was American black walnut, a single live-edge slab, the grain visible under a hand-rubbed oil finish. Around it sat 6 chairs upholstered in a deep, dusty terracotta linen. Prue sat down slowly, running her fingers along the edge of the table with an expression she was trying to keep neutral and not entirely succeeding. The Cartier bracelet on her wrist looked slightly startled in this room, Garrett noticed, in a way he could not immediately explain. He placed the envelope on the table and pulled out a chair with the deliberate, relaxed confidence of a man who believed he was in charge of the room. I'll be direct, Audra, Garrett said. Our attorney has flagged a problem with the original partition of the coastal parcel. When the Aldridge estate divided the land 3 years ago, the assessed value of this specific plot was calculated on the basis of its agricultural output and the residential square footage of the main structure. He folded his hands on the table. However, we have recently learned that you have made significant improvements to the property, without disclosure to the remaining estate trustees. Under the terms of the original partition agreement, material improvements to partitioned assets are subject to equity recalculation. Audra was standing at the kitchen counter with her back partially to them, measuring loose tea into a small ceramic pot with the unhurried focus of someone performing a ritual that predated the current inconvenience. You drove 40 minutes to tell me that your attorney found a clause in a partition agreement, she said without turning around. That must have been quite a Friday afternoon for your legal team, Audra. Garrett's voice tightened slightly at the edges, the way voices do when the speaker expected a faster capitulation. I am trying to have a reasonable adult conversation with you about what I believe was an oversight in the original partition. There was no oversight, Audra said. She carried a single ceramic cup of tea to the table and set it down in front of herself, then sat across from Garrett. She did not offer him anything. The improvements are not subject to equity recalculation. I've already spoken to my attorney about the clause you're referencing. It applies specifically to improvements made using funds drawn from the common trust. Every dollar spent on this property came from my own accounts. She picked up her teacup, accounts that had nothing to do with the Aldridge Trust, because your family made very sure of that in the original settlement. Garrett stared at her. He had prepared for tears. He had prepared for defensiveness. He had not prepared for this particular register of calm. The estate has a right of first refusal on the parcel, he said, pivoting with the ease of a man who had more than one document in his legal envelope. If you ever intend to sell, you are obligated to offer it to the family trust first. I'm not selling, Audra said. You might not have a choice, Garrett said. He leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping into the register of fatherly concern that he had always used with her during her marriage, the tone that sounded like generosity and functioned like a hand around the throat. This land is assessed at $640,000, Audra. The property tax obligations alone on a parcel with improved residential and agricultural structures are going to be significant. We've looked at your public filings. The farm's revenue has not demonstrated the kind of Garrett, Audra said. He stopped. What do you think this farm grows? She asked. He blinked. It was an unexpected question. Flowers, he said. Ornamental. You have some wholesale accounts with florists in Providence, I believe, and a small direct retail operation. Audra looked at him with an expression that he could not immediately categorize. It was not anger. It was not hurt. It was the expression of a person watching someone state something they believe to be true, knowing that the truth is so different from what they're describing that correcting it feels almost beside the point. My attorney will be in touch, she said finally, standing. Drive safe, Garrett. The coast road has a bad patch near Nanaquaket that hasn't been repaired since October. Chapter 3. The conversation he made her have. Garrett did not stand. His hand was already inside the envelope, fingers closing around the document he had brought. He withdrew it and placed it on the walnut table with a deliberately casual placement of a man who believed the paper itself carried power. I need you to look at this before I go, he said, out of respect for what you and my brother had. And because I would rather do this cleanly than through attorneys, I am prepared to offer you a structured buyout. The trust will purchase this parcel for $750,000, which is above assessed value. You'll be able to walk away from the property tax burden, relocate somewhere more manageable, and have a meaningful financial foundation to start fresh. He slid the document across the table toward her. The pages were thick, cream-colored. The header, bearing the name of a firm in Providence, that Garrett used precisely because their letterhead was intimidating. Prue, who had been very quiet, added in a bright, helpful voice, It's really a generous offer for a property that has, you know. She made a small, vague, wincing gesture in the direction of the exterior. The condition it's in. Audra looked at the document. She did not touch it. She looked at it with the flat, analytical attention of a woman reading a menu in a restaurant she has no intention of eating at. $750,000, Audra said. Which is, Garrett repeated, pressing gently, above assessed value. Audra slowly looked up from the document to Garrett's face. The assessed value is based on a survey conducted 3 years ago, she said, before I installed the cold storage facility, before I expanded the greenhouse to 4,800 square feet, before I established the specialty cut flower accounts. She paused. Before the contracts. Something in the room shifted. Garrett felt it without being able to identify it. What contracts? He said. Audra reached into the breast pocket of her thermal Henley and produced her phone, a plain, matte black case, no brand visible. She set it on the table and slid it toward him in exactly as he had just slid his document toward her. On the screen was an open email. The subject line read, Partnership Confirmation, Aldridge Farm at Tiverton Seasonal Supply Agreement, FY 2024-2027. The sender was the procurement director of a hospitality group that Garrett recognized because he had tried, unsuccessfully, to invest in their last round of funding 18 months ago. They operated 47 boutique hotels across New England and the Mid-Atlantic, with a flagship property in Watch Hill that had been profiled in every relevant publication twice in the past year. He read the body of the email. The language was formal, specific, and extremely financial. The agreement described a 3-year exclusive seasonal supply partnership for specialty cut flowers, dried botanicals, and custom floral installation services across 17 properties, with an annual minimum contract value of $480,000 per year. $480,000 per year for 3 years. The second contract, Audra said, reaching over and scrolling the screen with her index finger, is with a wedding event collective that books approximately 200 high-end events annually across Connecticut and Rhode Island. That agreement was finalized in January. She set the phone down. The third is with a botanical subscription service that ships direct to consumer, which has been operational for 14 months and has a current subscriber base of 11,412 households. Garrett stared at the phone. His mouth was slightly open. It was not a look that suited him. So when you say, Audra continued, picking up her teacup as though this were an entirely ordinary afternoon conversation, that this farm's revenue doesn't demonstrate the kind of financial viability that justifies the tax burden. She took a slow sip. I would be curious exactly which public filings your team was looking at, because the most recent Schedule F we filed with the IRS would have been quite informative. Prue had stopped looking around the room with detached assessment. She was now looking at Audra with an expression that was doing something complicated behind her enormous sunglasses, which she had not removed. Garrett reached for the document in front of him. His hand moved to pull it back. Audra's hand closed over it first, not quickly, not with any drama, just precisely, and held it flat on the table. "Leave it," she said quietly. "Audra, I said leave it." She released the document and sat back. She looked at Garrett Aldridge, the man who had sat in a boardroom 3 years ago, and calmly explained to the assembled Aldridge family trustees that his former sister-in-law's emotional instability following the divorce made her an unreliable steward of shared family assets. She had heard the recording. Her attorney had made sure of that. "Your attorney found a clause," Audra said. "You want the land back because you've heard from someone, probably one of the Newport waterfront developers, that the coastal agricultural parcels in this county are being looked at very differently than they were 3 years ago, particularly the ones with existing water rights." Garrett's jaw tightened. "I have those water rights," Audra said. "They transferred with the parcel. I had them verified and expanded under a separate filing 18 months ago." She set her teacup down. "So did the land trust attorneys who approached me in October about a conservation easement that would permanently protect the parcel's agricultural use and pay me a sum I am not going to disclose in this room." The silence was very specific. It was the silence of a man recalculating in real time. You can't place a conservation easement on land that has a right of first refusal clause attached to it without notifying the trust, Garrett said, and his voice, for the first time, had lost its leisurely certainty. "I notified the trust," Audra said. "The certified letter went to the trust's registered attorney of record on November 3rd. The trust had 60 days to respond. They did not respond." She looked at him steadily. "The easement was executed in January." Garrett stared. The color had not exactly left his face. It had rearranged itself into something different. Something that looked like the physical experience of understanding that the floor is not where you believed it to be. "That's not possible," he said. "Garrett," Audra said, and her voice carried the patient, final kindness of someone explaining something simple for the last time. "You received a certified letter in November from a land trust attorney. What did you do with it?" Silence. "Did you forward it to your attorney?" she asked. "Did you read it yourself? Did you open it?" More silence, the kind that answered the question. "Your attorney's office failed to respond within the legally required window," Audra said, "which is not my oversight. That is yours." Chapter 4. What the land was actually worth. Garrett reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. His movements had the jerky, urgent quality of someone trying to locate solid ground. He found his attorney's contact and called. The phone rang 3 times. "Harris," Garrett said when the call connected, his voice dropping into the sharp, clipped register of a man accustomed to having problems solved by other people. "Tell me about the certified letter, the one from the land trust, November 3rd. A pause on the line. Garrett's expression changed in the way that faces change when the person on the other end of a phone is saying something that cannot be unsaid. "You're certain," Garrett said. Another pause. "What do you mean it was routed to the inactive address?" Garrett's voice had gone very flat. "We updated the address of record in October. I told your office specifically." He stopped talking, listened. The silence in Audra's kitchen was, under the circumstances, remarkable in its quality. The fire in the hearth made small, companionable sounds. Outside the window, the late afternoon light was doing something beautiful across the covered beds in the far field, turning the white agricultural fleece into something that looked almost luminous. Audra watched Garrett listen to his attorney explain. She could only assume the nature and consequence of a missed certified correspondence window in a conservation easement filing. Fix it, Garrett said finally. Find a way to challenge the execution timeline. There has to be a procedural argument. She could hear faintly the tone of the attorney's voice through the phone. She could not hear the words, but she could read Garrett's face. And Garrett's face was doing something she had not seen it do in the 9 years she had known him. It was losing the argument. What do you mean there's no procedural challenge? Garrett said. His voice had dropped almost to a whisper. She placed a permanent conservation easement on land I have a right of first refusal on, Harris. That is not nothing. That cannot simply. He stopped again, listened again, his free hand pressed flat against the walnut table. Call me back, he said. He ended the call. The room was very quiet. Prue had removed her sunglasses. She was looking at her husband with an expression that Audra recognized from her own marriage. The expression of a woman who is performing a rapid internal recalculation about a man she has aligned herself with. The conservation easement, Audra said, because she felt it was only fair to explain, does not prevent me from continuing to operate the farm commercially. It simply ensures that the land can never be subdivided, developed, or used for any purpose other than active agriculture in perpetuity. It was placed at my request and with my full informed consent. She paused. What it does prevent is a waterfront developer from purchasing this parcel and building the 17-unit residential complex that Harborline Properties submitted a preliminary inquiry about to the County Planning Board last September. Garrett looked up from the table. I know about the inquiry, Audra said. I know that Harborline's preliminary site assessment valued this parcel at approximately $3.2 million for residential development potential. She picked up her teacup. I also know that you had a lunch meeting with Harborline's principal in October. Your wife's events planner booked the restaurant. She and I both used the same florist in Middletown. Small state. Garrett set his phone down on the walnut table. He did not slam it. He placed it with the careful, deliberate movement of a man trying very hard to control the appearance of what he was feeling. You knew, Garrett said. I knew in September, Audra said, when the county planning inquiry became public record, and you placed the easement to block the sale. I placed the easement, Audra said, because this is farmland. My farmland, and I intend to keep it that way. She set her teacup down with a small, clean sound. The fact that it also makes the parcel commercially worthless to a residential developer is simply a consequence I can live with. Garrett looked at the woman sitting across from him. He had known Audra Calloway for 9 years. He had watched her move through the Aldridge family orbit as his brother's quiet, competent wife, the one who managed the household accounts and organized the family's summer events, and never raised her voice at anyone. He had considered her, he realized now with a particular kind of clarity, as a background element, functional, unambitious. The kind of woman who could be managed. Why didn't you fight us at the board? Garrett said. His voice was different now. Not conciliatory exactly, but hollowed of its earlier authority, the way a room sounds after the furniture has been removed. 3 years ago, when we voted you out of the trust, you had grounds. Your attorney said you had grounds. Audra looked at him for a moment. I know what my attorney said, she replied. Then why didn't you fight? Because, Audra said, fighting you then would have cost me 3 years, and most of my resources to recover, at most a partial stake in a family trust that I no longer wanted any part of. She looked out the kitchen window at the covered fields, the old barn, the fence posts leaning into the coastal wind. You gave me the land, Garrett. You thought you were giving me nothing. 12 acres of rocky coastal farmland that your estate accountant called a liability. She looked back at him. I've been saying thank you for 3 years. Chapter 5. The letter she had already written. Garrett picked up the document he had brought. He looked at it. The cream-colored paper, the impressive letterhead, the structured buyout offer at $750,000, which had felt so generous when he'd had it printed Thursday afternoon, looked different now. It looked like a grocery list someone had written before they understood what the dinner was actually going to be. He folded it back into the envelope. Audra watched him do this without expression. Prue, Garrett said, standing. His voice had the careful, modulated quality of a man assembling himself in real time. We should get on the road. Prue stood immediately. She had been very quiet for a long time. She reached for a quilted bag from the back of the chair and pulled it to her chest, in a gesture that was not entirely unlike the gesture of a woman who has absorbed new information and is not sure yet what to do with it. At the doorway to the hall, Garrett paused. He did not turn around. His hand rested on the doorframe for a moment, and Audra could see, from where she sat, the slight tension in his shoulders. "For what it's worth," he said, to the wall in front of him, to the door, to some space between them that felt too large and too honest for the room, "we never thought you'd actually build something here." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement he was capable of producing. Audra looked at his back. "I know," she said. That was the plan. She heard his footsteps down the hall, the scrape of the front door against its frame, the crunch of gravel under expensive shoes. She heard the Range Rover's engine turn over, reverse out of the driveway, and disappear down the road toward the coast. The farmhouse was quiet again. The fire had settled into a steady, low pulse of heat. Through the kitchen window, the afternoon light had moved to the long, horizontal gold of late afternoon, and the covered fields in the distance had taken on the quality of something resting, something that knew what it was going to become. Audra cleared the single teacup from the table. She carried it to the sink, rinsed it under warm water, and set it on the drying rack. On the kitchen island, her phone buzzed with a message from her attorney, Wren Ashby, who had handled the easement filing and had been, Audra suspected, waiting to hear how the afternoon had gone. "He came?" the message read. Audra typed back, "He came, and he left." A pause. Then, the easement held? Audra looked out the kitchen window at her fields, at the 12 acres that a man had handed her like a consolation prize, certain they were handing her a burden. At the greenhouse she had built from the ground up over one winter. At the cold storage facility she had installed herself, learning from video tutorials on a laptop in a farmhouse with no reliable heating, in the January of the worst year of her life. "The easement held," she typed. Another pause. Then her attorney sent a single additional message. "The land trust also confirmed this afternoon. The conservancy payment hits your account on the 1st. 1.1 million, as agreed." Audra set her phone down on the soapstone counter. She stood in her kitchen for a long moment, in the particular stillness of a woman who has spent years working towards something that has now, quietly, fully arrived. She had not cried on the day the family trust had voted her out. She had not cried when her former husband had signed the papers. She had not cried when the estate accountant had described this land as a liability, in a room full of people who expected her to argue. And she had simply said nothing, and folded the property deed into her bag, and walked out of the building into a gray December afternoon 3 years ago. She did not cry now either. That was not what this felt like. It felt like something much quieter than triumph. It felt like a long breath finally released. Like the moment after a storm when the air goes clean and the light comes back in a way that makes ordinary things look briefly extraordinary. She picked up her phone one more time and looked at the number. $1.1 million. Conservancy payment for land she was not selling, land she was protecting in perpetuity. Land that a developer had assessed at $3.2 million, and that a family trust had dismissed as worthless in the same fiscal quarter. She would keep the farm. She would keep the supply contracts. She would keep the subscriber base and the wholesale accounts, and the 4,800 square feet of greenhouse that she had built, in a very real and specific sense, by hand. She slid the phone into her pocket and walked toward the back door of the farmhouse. Outside, the late afternoon had gone full gold. The covered beds stretched away from her in their long, even rows. A few months from now, those covers would come off, and this field would be, as it had been last spring and the spring before, something that stopped people's cars on the road, something that made strangers take photographs. Ranunculus in 17 varieties, anemones in white and burgundy, and a deep, almost purple, that Audra had spent 2 seasons developing from seed. Sweet peas climbing the trellis sections along the eastern fence, Lisianthus and chocolate cosmos, and a dahlias program she'd been building for 4 years that was currently the subject of a feature request from the hospitality group's design director. She walked the perimeter of the nearest bed, trailing her fingers lightly along the edge of the fleece covering. The ground was firm beneath her boots. The soil underneath was exactly what she had made it. Amended and prepared and tended over 3 years of early mornings and late nights, and the specific sustaining discipline of someone who has decided that the ground beneath her feet is worth every ounce of what she has left to give. She stopped at the far corner of the field, where the land met the low stone wall that marked the property boundary, and she looked back at the farmhouse. The kitchen window glowed with warm interior light. The smoke from the chimney rose straight up in the still air. The barn stood solid against the darkening sky. It was not a grand property. It was not a spectacle. There was no Maybach in the driveway, no museum-quality art on the walls, no marble flown in from anywhere. What it was entirely and completely and without negotiation hers. Built from the thing they had handed her as an insult. Grown from the 12 acres of liability they had been so pleased to dispose of. Garrett Aldridge had driven 40 minutes to take it back. He had driven 40 minutes home, with nothing but the sound of his attorney explaining what a miscertified letter actually costs. Audra stood at the edge of her field in the last of the afternoon light, and she let herself feel, very quietly, the full dimension of what 3 years of silence had built. The ranunculus would be up in 6 weeks. She had orders already placed through June. She turned back toward the house. There was work to do before dark. If this story found you at exactly the right moment, if you know what it is to be handed someone's rejection and turn it into your foundation, then you already understand what Silent Queen's Rise is about. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. The women in these stories are never the ones you expected, and neither are you.